Now I'd like to say something about art, particularly the art of painting and its development in Pakistan. But before I do that, it would be useful to understand the background of Indian art, and particularly the activities of certain painters who, after partition, became what I would call the precursors. I have Abdur Rahman Chughtai, Haji Sharif, and Ustad Bakhsh in particular in mind. Let it be remembered that Chughtai's role, both as a painter and as a symbol in what I would call Muslim nationalism in India, was profound. Hindus had a number of painters, great and good, and when for the first time I heard the name of Chughtai and learnt that he was of an all India eminence, admired by our great political leaders, poets, and writers, I was thrilled. And my reaction was, and the thought that went through my mind was, that now we the Muslims have a painter of our own. Having heard Chughtai's name, I started asking questions from people who I thought could answer them, wanting to know more about him, what sort of painting he did, because Illustrated Weekly didn't print him. I don't remember Illustrated Weekly printing Chughtai in color or even in black and white. And I learned that Chughtai's fame rested on his Muraqqa-e-Ghalib, that he had illustrated our great poet and done such a fine job of it that he was internationally famous. I hadn't had the opportunity to see, it was impossible to see the original, to see even colored reproductions of Chughtai for quite some time, until later, if I remember correctly, I saw his work in black and white and also in color, not very good colored reproduction, if I remember, in some Urdu magazines which used to be printed and published from Lahore. Maybe Narange-e-Khayal was one of them. I can't be sure. But I did see some of his work, and liked them. It's only much later when I came to Pakistan and had opportunity to saw a lot more of Chughtai, to talk to friends about him, that I discovered that he was a great painter of his kind, a painter who sought perfection, a painter whose worldview was a dream, a painter who was very nostalgic about the lost glory of what was Islamic culture, particularly the Turco-Persian Mughal culture in India. And that in his works he used images and symbols of dress, of setting, of architecture to recreate this world of dream, to recreate his own profound nostalgia for this lost world. But what was remarkable about Chughtai was that his paintings, and again I am talking of his Muraqqa-e-Ghalib, because I think his son would say that I am blaspheming, but I would say that that was the crown and glory of Chughtai. He never reached equal eminence again. And I must be allowed to say that whatever he painted after that was a decline as far as I am concerned. In any case, paintings in Muraqqa-e-Ghalib, besides possessing whatever I have said just now, also possessed or at least revealed a remarkable soul. They had a meaning, they had a value, they had a significance in terms of feeling, and the feeling which these paintings cultivated was what I would call the soul of Ghazal, in Urdu translated as Ruh-e-Taghazzul. The peculiar essence of feeling and passion and meaning, emotive meaning I mean, that you get in Ghazal, Chughtai possessed the remarkable skill of capturing that. Not only that, because of his romantic attachment with the past glory of the Islamic Mughal culture in India, Chughtai, for my mind, came to be associated with Musaddas-e-Hali, with much of the work of Iqbal, with much of the work of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, because in his own art, what he was trying to do was to give shape and form to a renaissance of Muslim nationalism. An awareness, whether it was right or wrong, I'm not interested in discussing the merit of it just now. An awareness and recognition of identity as a Musliman and his aspirations for the future. The fact that Chughtai looked to the past does not qualify him entirely and fully as an escapist. Because even when, like Hali, he was looking at the past, trying to revive and reconstruct the past in terms of his skill and his art, the movement or the passion which made them do it was also an harbinger of the future. The direction was to redefine, to reconstitute, to recreate the culture of Islam, the identity of the Musliman as of the present, so that both come into their own to face the future. Unfortunately, Chughtai's impact on the development of art after partition was non-existent, and the reasons for that I shall be discussing presently. While Chughtai was interested through his painting in doing something similar to the political, cultural and literary movements that were waging in those days, to make the Muslims aware of their destiny, of their past, their future. Ustad Allah Bakhsh was working very hard in Lahore from his studio, painting landscapes, village scenes, scenes from Hindu mythology, in a style which can be recognized as what was then in India established as academic, for his rich, basically Hindu clientele. Without intending to be derogatory, I would call Ustad Allah Bakhsh a bazaar painter, because he painted for a market. He didn't paint like Chughtai to capture the mind and soul of the people. Because of this, again, despite his immense talent, considerable success, and at one time during President Ayub's regime, his adoption as the official symbol and mascot of art in Pakistan, Ustad Allah Bakhsh again could not influence modern painters or painters who came to be known as modern in Pakistan, because both technically and intellectually they were of a different breed altogether. Haji Sharif was a miniaturist, a traditionalist, a painter from a family of painters who did what his grandfather had done, what his great-grandfather had done, and he used to paint immaculate copies of miniature paintings from the old school, Kangra and others, basically Kangra, for once again a rich clientele, because these paintings bought by Hindu baniyas who had money consisted of scenes from the romantic story of Krishna and Radha, Krishna and his gopis, Krishna the cowherd, very colorful paintings. But unfortunately, because either he didn't work on with the same material his great-grandfather and grandfather had done, or painters of past had done, not as immaculate, not as finished as miniatures of the past, but done extremely well. And he continued doing it until his death at an old age, ripe old age of 80 something, 80 plus. Much later, after the birth of Pakistan. And actually he too, even though Jamil Naqsh, one of our modern painters, claims to have learned to paint miniature from Haji Sharif, did not have any influence on the way art developed. What I am trying to say is that these painters, who could be called our pre-partition stalwarts in that part of India which came to constitute Pakistan, between them and painters like Shakir Ali and Ahmad Parvez and others, there is a clean and definite break. There is no bridge between them. It seems as if a chapter closed irrevocably and another began afresh. And this is the reason why the works of Shakir Ali and a number of other painters who came to be influenced by him found their bearings not in the history of painting in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, but in Paris, in Europe, other cities of Europe, and even America. This is a very interesting feature of the beginning of what I would call Pakistani art, because both Pakistan and Pakistani painting, their beginning is the result of a clean break. In other words, the tradition which Zubaida Agha, Shakir Ali and others sought and found was not natural to them. It was not a part of their culture, their language. And because of the fact that for all practical purposes the borders between India and Pakistan were closed, that the two were enemy countries, that having divided the country nothing was to be shared between us, unfortunately, there was no opportunity for these painters, or if there were opportunities, they had no desire to cross the border, to fly over the border and to go to India and first study and absorb a tradition of modern painting is stretching over hundreds of years in India. This is sad, and the nature of the start of painting in Pakistan, the way it did under the circumstances which I have described, came to have profound influence on how it developed and certain intellectual and stylistic characteristics it acquired. Some of the remarks I made earlier about Shakir Ali may lead to some misunderstanding. When I said that Shakir Ali did not link himself with the tradition of painting in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, I do not mean to suggest that he did not possess enough knowledge of that. This is not a matter of a study and knowledge. What I am saying is that for reasons best known to him, and I never had occasion to discuss it with him, he decided to make a complete break from that tradition. And please remember that in this Shakir Ali was not alone. You will find that painters starting at about the same time or earlier in India had also been seeking inspiration as well as the form, content and grammar of their works from other sources, particularly in Europe. So in a sense it could be said that Shakir Ali as well as a large number of modern Indian painters were a common phenomena which occurred after the independence of India, the partition of the country and coming into being of two independent sovereign states. At this point, I would also like to clarify certain misunderstandings as to who is the first originator of modernism in Pakistani painting? Is it Shakir Ali or Zubaida Agha? I am not very familiar with Zubaida Agha's work, but I understand that chronologically she began painting in the modern style, which she also had picked up from Paris and European sources before Shakir Ali appeared here. So in that sense, she could be called the first to introduce modern painting into Pakistan. At the same time, having said this, I would also like to explain the word introduce. She introduced modern style, modern grammar, and modern syntax of painting in Pakistan in the sense that she was doing it herself. But to this day, I am not aware of Zubaida Agha having formed any school, or no painter has told me yet that he or she was ever influenced by her. This was reserved for Shakir Ali when he came to settle down in Pakistan, and particularly from the time when he joined the National College of Arts in Lahore, first as a teacher, as a professor, and later on as the head of the Department of Fine Arts in that institution. And it is from his position in the National College of Art that Shakir Ali exercised the profound influence which came to dominate and which still does painting in Pakistan. Shakir Ali had been to Paris, and from André Lot he had learned the rudiments, the language and the grammar of what is called Cubism, which is essentially a form of painting or a kind of painting which was developed by Picasso and Braque, and their inspiration of course was Cézanne. What happened in this style of painting or in this way of painting is that the old concept of creating pictures as windows to reality disappears. The optical perspective that you see in traditional paintings, they also disappear. And what the painter does is to take objects, human or some other object like a vase or an apple or a flower vase, and he paints it in cross section flat on the canvas surface. The idea is to give you not one or two but multiple points of view of the same object in a manner which is called analytical. This was the style which Shakir Ali learned, I would say, to perfection, and painted some of his earlier works in that style. Later on, Shakir Ali was to develop into his mature style, which was essentially away from the complexities, the analytical complexities of Cubism. Shakir Ali was a master of line. He was a very, very good draftsman. And what he came to do later on was to exploit the richness and the value of lines. And in doing that, in using line on his canvas surfaces, what he did was to empty his canvas of objects and images. In some of his later canvases, you will find him painting only one object. Either it's a vase or an orb or a woman or a flower, and he does in a way as to create an effect of vast, wide plain and space, a kind of a spatial richness. And he does this in a manner that a space itself becomes its own image in his pictures. Shakir Ali was led to this because of his own psychological makeup, and as far as I have been able to understand it. Basically, he was a very lonely man. He was a solitary, as I would call it. And it is this feeling of solitariness, it is this feeling of being enveloped by a space rather than being surrounded by people, by friends, which informs, I would say, the emptiness, which is a very rich emptiness of Shakir Ali's paintings. Many people do not know, because calligraphy is associated with the name of Sadequain, that Shakir Ali was one of the finest painters of what I would call calligraphic paintings. And once again, in doing these paintings, Shakir Ali did not have to deviate from his mature style which he had cultivated. He used lines, he used spaces in a very, very subtle, richly modulated manner, almost musical, and gave a kind of painterly, a quality of painterly richness to his calligraphic paintings, which you find missing from Sadequain. But I do not think that I have got time here to comment in detail on the niceties of Shakir Ali's painting, the complexity of his style, or the progression of his development from Cubism to what he came to do before he died. I would like to talk here more about Shakir Ali's impact on other painters and on paintings in Pakistan. I remember Ahmad Parvez saying to me once that before Shakir Ali came to Pakistan, he used to do pseudo-classical paintings, traditional paintings, human figures, Jesus Christ, Madonna, things like that, under the tutelage of his uncle, who I understand was a painter. And he was taught that this is the only way you can paint. This is the only way you could achieve perfection. There was no other way available to him to become a painter which he wanted to. He said that he was fortunate enough to meet Shakir Ali, who gave him a catalogue of painting done by some modern painters, maybe Picasso, Braque, he didn't say who. And Ahmad Parvez added that he brought it home, and as he started turning over the pages, he realized that new worlds, not just a world, but new worlds were opening before him. He realized as if chains had broken off to which he was tied. He felt as if he had been liberated by someone. And he shouted that I am a painter, realizing that he was now free to paint any way he wanted to. Subsequently, following this path of freedom, as a result of having been emancipated by the influence of Shakir Ali, Ahmad Parvez emerged as one of the major painters of Pakistan. The question is, wherein lies this freedom? What is it which we call freedom in painting? And looking at the paintings of Shakir Ali and Ahmad Parvez, Ali Imam, Moin Najmi, and many others who formed a group in Lahore around Shakir Ali, you will realize that each of them were confronted with a challenge. And the challenge was to discover the peculiar talent they possessed and the characteristic style which this talent would lead them to. If the talent lay in doing figurative works, fine. If that talent led them to the composition of designs, to create paintings as designs of a space and color and line, then that was the way to follow. In other words, what modernism suggested to them, as Cézanne had demonstrated long ago, that it's not enough to accept what your eyes had perceived. That was not enough to follow the dictates of your eyes, but to accept this data provided by your visual sense and let it be interpreted by your feelings and above all by your mind. The question is why? Because he realized that in order to depict truth, a truth of object, in order to depict reality, the painter had to look at it from more than one angles, from more than one perspective. And when he did it, what he found was that strangely enough, the vase didn't look like a vase as the eyes had conveyed it to be. That a painted canvas, the painted surface of the canvas was not a window opening into reality or creating an illusion of reality. In other words, if the painter felt that a figure in distance, which according to traditional notation of perspective should be smaller than the figure standing up front, if he felt that that figure was to be of the same size as the person standing up front, and if he felt that that was the true way of depicting whatever he wanted to, he could do that. It's very interesting to find that this sort of thing had been done much earlier by our miniature painters, because they did not follow the scientific scheme of perspective which had been discovered in the Renaissance and perfected by the time Picasso and Braque and Shakir and others came to paint. So therein lay that sense of freedom. First, to be true to yourself, true to what you have seen and perceived and thought about reality, to think about it, to analyze it, and then to paint it, put it down on canvas. Of course, the premium was on the total integrity of the artist as a person. This is what Shakir introduced into Pakistani painting. And we find that to this day, painting in Pakistan bears his stamp. As I have said earlier, Shakir and Ahmad Parvez dominated the art scene, and painting in their own way, though following the same path, gave to Pakistani painting a variety of styles, a variety of ways of looking at the world. Whereas Shakir is far more puritanical, I would even say intellectual compared to Ahmad Parvez. While there is reticence in his painting, as there was in the man himself, while he is a minimalist in the sense that in the best of his works, he came to use less and less of imagery and more of a space. We find that Ahmad Parvez was spontaneous, exuberant, even irresponsible. His works are an explosion of color, even though what explodes turns into flowers, into a bouquet of colors. Ahmad Parvez's palette was far richer than that of Shakir, because he was essentially an emotional man, an exhibitionist. As Ahmad Parvez told me once that his favorite bird was the crowing cockerel, who at dawn crows from the barnyard thinking that it is he who wakes up the sun. Ahmad Parvez, who felt alienated from society, who was a bohemian, who thought that because he was a painter, society owed it to him to look after him. And the only way he could come to term with life, he could come to term with the world, he could come to term with himself, was in his work, in which all these negative, destructive, chaotic tendencies typical of his characters, were orchestrated, given a design and a form. In many ways, I would say that compared to Shakir Ali, Ahmad Parvez is a visceral painter. And I have purposely mentioned these two because to my mind, they form the two poles of modern painting in Pakistan. They are the two antipodes. Ali Imam, another painter of the same generation, who in his early career, before he left for London, used to paint sentimental landscapes in the style of Bengal School of Art. When he came in contact with Shakir Ali, his style also changed. And there was a particular period when he was teaching art at Bhavalpur Sadiq School, when he did a number of painting which he described as house series. In these paintings, he did fantastic work. Houses were not painted in 3 dimension. They were put as signs flat on the canvas surface, sometimes on their base, sometimes upside down on their roof. And by doing it, Ali Imam succeeded in creating a very intriguing and interesting design. A design which in terms of aesthetics, modern or conventional, would be found impeccable. When he went to England, Ali Imam started doing series of horses, mother and child, all done in a modern style, even though his work was figurative. And if you look at these works, you will find it very difficult to see a horse painted as a horse, or mother and child painted as mother and child. They look very awkward, even grotesque. They are not painted in details. They are painted flat on the surface, not according to the rules of traditional perspective and drawing. And yet, the color application is in such a manner that even though everything is flat on the canvas surface, effects of depths are created in terms of tonal differences, in terms of differences in the application of thin and thick paint, in terms of the application of brush and palette knife. There are many other painters whom I have named earlier, and I don't have time to go into detail about them. So, from these senior painters, I would move on to a group of very talented painters who followed them, most of them students of Shakir Ali. But before I do that, I would like to talk about 2 other major painters of Pakistan, Gulgee and Sadequain. I have said earlier that Shakir Ali's role in modern painting in Pakistan was that of a catalyst. But this had no implication, this had no impact on Gulgee. Gulgee's work in modern style, he picked up, learned from an American painter who was visiting Pakistan. She was what would be called a gestural painter, an action painter. And Gulgee was profoundly influenced by her. Essentially, the paintings that Gulgee does, they represent the gestures, the movements that a painter would make instinctively with brush and palette knife in his hand against a canvas surface. And the impact or the impressions of these movements left on the surface make up the design of his painting. In other words, these paintings, if they represent anything, they represent the sensation of pure movement. And in doing this, Gulgee is unique in Pakistan. I don't think anybody else has tried to follow him. And I do not know of any Pakistani painter who has picked up enough courage to do what Gulgee has been doing extremely well for the last so many years. Gulgee has also done some calligraphic painting, and curiously he has orchestrated, integrated his gestural movements, movements of his hand, of his arm, in such a manner as to describe calligraphic signs and symbols, sometimes even words written in that manner. You will remember that the traditional calligraphy was written with hand, and the movements which you find in the traditional calligraphy is mostly from the wrist. There was a particular posture in which the fellow sat and worked. Gulgee writes his words, if I may say so, far more freely, in the sense that sometimes he uses his arms, sometimes his whole body to do that. And he does it on a much larger canvas, on monumental sizes. Gulgee is as brilliant a colorist as Ahmad Parvez, and the combination of the two have created some of the finest works that I have seen done in Pakistan. And I would make bold to say that not only in Pakistan, but maybe any parts of the world. To move on to Sadequain, I personally feel that imaginatively he was a painter of a much higher caliber and higher order than anyone in Pakistan. He was a world in himself, a writer of Urdu prose and very fine prose at that, a poet who has written hundreds of rubaiyats on painting and painters, which is a unique contribution to Urdu literature, which has not been explored. One of the finest draftsmen. Who could draw lines as if they were live wires, as if they were charged with magic. Sadequain's paintings are once again related to the painter's perception of his own personality and what he thought was his relationship with the world and the society in which he lived. He started, as Shakir did, as an imitator of one of the modern masters, in his case Picasso, moved on to the delectable art of Matisse without possessing Matisse's brilliance with color, and finally, having discovered Karachi, the desert of Sindh, and the magic of cactus, he came to relate human figures with, if I may say so, vegetable figures in a manner as to give the cactus the properties of human beings and let the human beings acquire the property or the characteristics of vegetative growth, that's when Sadequain's brilliant and I would say great career started. I've said earlier that Sadequain was not a colorist, which doesn't mean that he couldn't use color. What I'm saying is that Sadequain's aesthetics, which informed his lines, his design, the choice of his color, the way he applied and used color, they were not related to the creation of beauty. And I would make bold to say that beauty as we understand it had no place in Sadequain's art. He is essentially a painter of pain, of guilt, of suffering, of alienation, and all these things, all these feelings or the thoughts associated with them become the properties of his art. In this connection, I would like to refer your attention to Sadequain's illustration of Ghalib's verses and compare them with Chughtai's. Chughtai's illustrations of Ghalib are beautiful, graceful, elegant, colorful. On the contrary, Sadequain chose not to use what I would call the taghazzul of ghazal tradition, the music and the sentiment of the ghazal tradition, but he decided, because this suited his mind and his psyche, to use yet another part of Persian and Urdu ghazal, which concerns the cruelty of the beloved, decapitation of human body and head, torture, suffering, guilt, pain. And one of the typical symbols of Sadequain, of which he was very proud, consisted of two things. One, the portrait of a painter with his own decapitated head in his hand, and the other, the head of the painter, and in both Sadequain painted himself. No one can mistake that. As I said, the other, the head of the painter, in which crows had come to nest. He pushed this preoccupation, I would say, to an extreme, when he came to be preoccupied with the effects of cobweb, when he started scratching his paintings with the edge of a razor blade, and also in his illustration from the Ghalib, used cobwebs to suggest decay, decomposition, to suggest the neglect of old values, values of culture, values of life, values of society. Whether this was right or not is a question which I do not think applies to Sadequain. The question is that if he felt so, if he thought so, in his painting, he also convinces us that this is true. Sadequain's later voyage or later entry or career as calligrapher, as a calligraphist, in my opinion, was a disaster. He had nothing new to contribute, though he could write in any style, any of the 29 or 30 or 42 traditional styles of calligraphy. Sadequain did not create any new style of his own, because his approach to calligraphy was not that of a traditionalist, even though he knew the traditionalist's art. His approach was that of a modern painter, of a modern artist, who was free to draw any way he wanted to. And in doing this, he was as fecund, as fertile, as abundant, as full of variety as nature itself. So some of those works which Sadequain did in black and white only, which are in the form of writing alone, like his Surah Rahman, which he wrote and which hangs in Lahore Museum today, they give us some pleasure of movement, of rhythm, of line, the contrast between black and white. But when he came to illustrate the written words of the Quran with the color which you get from felt pens, I thought he had come to a point where he was wasting himself and his life.